The morning mist clung to the hills of Senlac Ridge like a burial shroud, and perhaps that was fitting, for on this October day in 1066, the fate of an entire civilization would be decided by sword and spear, by shield and arrow, in a clash so brutal and decisive that when the sun set, England itself would be forever changed. This is the story of Hastings, the battle that didn't just defeat an army, it erased a 1,000-year-old way of life in a single day. Picture this. You're standing on that ridge, the cold autumn air biting at your face, watching two worlds collide. On one side, the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, a bristling hedge of iron and oak held by men who had ruled this land for 6 centuries. On the other, the Norman war machine, cavalry and archers combined in a tactical revolution that would reshape medieval warfare forever. Between them lay not just a battlefield, but the grave of Anglo-Saxon England. What you're about to witness isn't just another medieval battle. It's the most complete cultural obliteration in European history. Within 20 years of this single day's fighting, over 4,000 Anglo-Saxon landowners would be replaced by fewer than 200 Norman nobles. The English language would nearly vanish from official use. Ancient customs would crumble. Even the very stones would change, as Norman castles rose like iron fists across a conquered landscape. But how did it come to this? How did one day's bloodshed wipe out centuries of civilization? The answer lies in a perfect storm of ambition, betrayal, and tactical genius that converged on a hilltop in Sussex. And it all began with a dying king's broken promise. January 5th, 1066. Edward the Confessor, King of England, drew his last breath without naming an heir. In that moment, he didn't just die. He lit the fuse on a powder keg that would explode across Europe. 3 men claimed his throne, 3 armies would march, and only one would survive. Harold Godwinson moved first. Earl of Wessex, brother-in-law to the dead king, he seized the crown before Edward's body had grown cold. The Witan, England's council of nobles, confirmed his coronation the very next day. But speed and legitimacy are different things entirely. Across the Channel, William of Normandy was sharpening his sword and nursing a grudge that would soon drown England in blood. William's claim wasn't just political ambition, it was personal. Years earlier, Edward had allegedly promised him the throne. Harold himself had supposedly sworn an oath to support William's claim, an oath sealed with sacred relics that made breaking it not just treachery, but sacrilege. Whether these promises were real or fabricated matters little now. What mattered was that William believed them, and he had the army to enforce his belief. But William wasn't Harold's only problem. From the frozen fjords of Norway came Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking, a warrior king whose very name meant hard ruler. His claim was older still, rooted in treaties between earlier Norwegian and English kings. At his side rode Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother, consumed by hatred and bent on revenge. The Anglo-Saxon England that Harold now ruled was no barbarian kingdom. This was a sophisticated civilization that had flourished for over 600 years. From the ashes of Roman Britain had risen something remarkable. A society built on 3 pillars: the working man who tilled the soil, the churchman who saved souls, and the warrior who defended both. Their language, Old English, had produced literary masterpieces like Beowulf. Their laws were codified and just. Their administrative system of shires and hundreds was the envy of Europe. Yet for all its achievements, Anglo-Saxon England was about to face its greatest test. The military traditions that had served for centuries were colliding with new ways of war. Harold's army was built around the shield wall, that unbreakable line of interlocked shields and jabbing spears. At its heart stood the housecarls, perhaps the finest infantry in Europe, wielding their terrible 2-handed battle axes with devastating skill. These weren't just soldiers, they were the steel backbone of Anglo-Saxon resistance. But across the Channel, William was assembling something different, something revolutionary. His army combined heavy cavalry, disciplined infantry, and massed archers in a tactical system that would dominate European warfare for centuries. Norman knights weren't just mounted warriors, they were shock troops, armored battering rams that could shatter enemy lines with the thunder of their charge. The spring of 1066 brought preparation and dread in equal measure. Harold stationed his army along the south coast, eyes fixed on the grey waters of the Channel, waiting for William's invasion that never came. Week after week, month after month, the English stood guard while their supplies dwindled and their patience wore thin. By August, Harold had no choice but to dismiss the Fyrd, the militia that formed the backbone of his forces. The men had to return to their fields for the harvest. England was vulnerable, and everyone knew it. That's when Hardrada struck. In September, 300 longships darkened the Humber, carrying 8,000 Norse warriors hungry for English gold. They smashed through the northern defences at Fulford Gate, leaving the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria broken and bleeding in the marshes. York surrendered without a siege. The raven banners of Norway flew over England's second city. Harold's response was nothing short of miraculous. In 4 days, he marched his army 185 miles from London to York. His men moved like ghosts through the English countryside, covering impossible distances on foot, sleeping little, eating less, driven by their king's iron will and desperate purpose. When Hardrada's scouts finally spotted the English approaching Stamford Bridge, it was already too late. September 25th, 1066. The Battle of Stamford Bridge erupted like thunder on a clear day. The Vikings, caught without their armor in the warm autumn sun, scrambled to form their shield wall. But Harold's fury was unstoppable. The Anglo-Saxon charge shattered the Norse line like a hammer blow. Hardrada fell with an arrow through his throat. Tostig died beside him, the traitor brother meeting a traitor's end. Of the 300 ships that had brought the invasion, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. England erupted in celebration. The last great Viking invasion had been crushed. The threat from the north was finished forever. But even as Harold's men were stripping armor from Norse corpses, new sails were appearing on the southern horizon. William had been watching and waiting. Now, with Harold's army exhausted and far from the coast, the Duke of Normandy made his move. September 28th, 1066. The Norman fleet beached at Pevensey Bay like a tide of steel and timber. 700 ships disgorged 7,000 men onto English soil. Knights led their war horses down wooden planks. Archers strung their bows. Infantry formed ranks on the shingle. William himself leaped into the surf, stumbled, and fell face first into the sand. His knights gasped in horror, seeing an omen of defeat, but the Duke rose, sand streaming from his hands, and declared, "See, I have seized England with both hands." Harold received the news while he was still in York, celebrating victory over the Vikings. In that moment, triumph turned to ash. His army was 300 miles from the new threat, exhausted from battle, depleted by losses. Any reasonable commander would have retreated to London, gathered reinforcements, chosen his ground carefully. But Harold Godwinson was many things. Reasonable wasn't one of them. The king who had just force-marched his army across England to destroy one invasion, now prepared to do it again. South they went, through English countryside that would soon be Norman territory. Villages turned out to watch them pass, not knowing they were witnessing the last march of Anglo-Saxon England. Behind the royal standards and glittering mail, destiny was catching up with every step. October 13th, 1066. 2 armies converged on the rolling hills near Hastings. Harold chose his ground on Senlac Ridge, a position that seemed impregnable. His shield wall would hold the high ground, while Norman cavalry shattered themselves against English steel. It was a plan born of desperation and tactical genius in equal measure. But William wasn't just any enemy, and this wouldn't be just any battle. The stage was set for a collision that would echo through centuries. On one side, the last Anglo-Saxon king, desperate to preserve a civilization. On the other, the Norman duke, determined to claim what he believed was rightfully his. Between them lay a field that would soon be carpeted with the dead. And on that field, the future of England would be written in blood. Dawn broke grey and cold on October 14th, 1066. The mist that had shrouded Senlac Ridge began to lift, revealing 2 armies that had spent a sleepless night preparing for what both sides knew would be a fight to the death. Harold's Anglo-Saxons held the ridge like a human fortress, their shields locked in that ancient formation that had held this island for centuries. Below them, Spread across the valley floor, William's Normans stirred in the pre-dawn darkness, knights checking their armor, archers counting arrows, infantry sharpening spears. This wasn't just about crowns or kingdoms anymore. This was about survival. Harold knew that defeat meant the end of everything his people had built. William understood that failure meant disgrace, exile, and probably death. There would be no second chances, no negotiated peace. One of these men would be king by nightfall. The other would be food for ravens. The Norman army that assembled in those grey morning hours was unlike anything England had ever faced. Picture this tactical revolution in motion. At the front, Breton and Norman infantry formed dense ranks, their shields overlapping, spears thrust forward in disciplined lines. Behind them, the archers, not the handful of bowmen that Anglo-Saxon armies might field, but hundreds of them, their quivers bristling with bodkin points, designed to punch through mail and flesh with equal ease. And behind them all, the heart of William's war machine. 2,000 heavy cavalry, the cream of Norman knighthood, mounted on war horses bred for battle. These weren't just mounted soldiers, they were living weapons, each knight worth a dozen infantry in the shock of combat. Their lances were 12 feet of ash and steel. Their armor was the finest mail that Norman smiths could forge. Their horses were trained to bite and kick, to trample fallen enemies, to charge through flame and blood without flinching. The English line that faced them was smaller but no less formidable. 7,000 men stood shoulder to shoulder on that ridge, and at their core were the housecarls, Harold's personal guard. These warriors had trained since childhood for this moment. Their two-handed axes could split a man from skull to sternum in a single blow. Their shields were iron-bossed oak that could turn aside lance points and sword thrusts. They had stood beside Harold through every campaign, every battle, every desperate hour. They would stand with him now, until death claimed them all. 9 o'clock in the morning. The battle began not with trumpets or war cries, but with the whistle of arrows darkening the sky. Norman archers launched volley after volley into the English ranks, their shafts arcing high before plunging down like deadly rain. But Harold had chosen his ground well. The ridge's angle meant most arrows either fell short or passed overhead. Those that found their mark struck the great wall of English shields with sounds like hail on a roof. The arrow storm was just the beginning. William's infantry advanced up the slope, their war cries echoing across the valley. Bretons on the left, Normans in the center, French allies on the right. They climbed toward the shield wall like a human tide. Spears leveled, shields raised, feet slipping on the wet grass of the October morning. What happened next became the stuff of legend. The shield wall held. Not just held, but held absolutely. The Norman infantry crashed against that line of iron and oak-like waves against a cliff. Spears thrust between shields, finding gaps in armor, punching through leather and mail to the flesh beneath. Axes rose and fell in deadly rhythm. The slope before the English line grew slick with Norman blood. For 3 hours, wave after wave of attacks broke against Harold's defenses. The Normans would charge, fight, die, retreat, regroup, and charge again. Each assault left more bodies on the grass. Each repulse left the defenders bloodier but unbroken. William himself rode among his men, rallying them, cursing them, threatening them, pleading with them. Nothing worked. The English stood like a wall of steel and flesh, unmovable, unbreakable. Then came the moment that changed everything. The Breton cavalry on William's left flank, already bloodied by their failed attacks on the English right, suddenly broke and fled. Not a tactical retreat, but genuine panic. Horses wheeled and galloped back down the slope, their riders either dead in their saddles or clinging on in terror. The sight of Norman knights in full flight sent a shockwave through William's entire army. A rumor spread like wildfire through the Norman ranks. William was dead. The Duke had fallen. The invasion was over. What began as a Breton collapse threatened to become a Norman rout. Men began to edge backwards. Voices called for retreat. The carefully ordered battle lines started to waver and bend, but William was not dead. Seeing his army on the verge of disintegration, he did something that would be remembered for centuries. He pulled off his helmet, revealing his face to his panicking soldiers, and rode along the front of his line. "Look at me," he roared. "I live. God still fights with us." His voice cut through the chaos like a sword through silk. The retreat stopped. The line steadied. The battle continued. Yet that moment of near collapse had consequences William couldn't foresee. Seeing the Breton cavalry fleeing, part of the English right wing did something that violated every principle of shield wall tactics. They pursued. Drunk on the sight of Norman knights in flight, hundreds of Anglo-Saxon warriors broke ranks and charged down the hill after the retreating enemy. It was exactly the mistake Harold had trained them never to make. The shield wall's strength lay in its unity, its unbroken front. Individual courage meant nothing if it left gaps in the line. And William, veteran of a dozen campaigns, recognized the opportunity immediately. Hidden Norman reserves swept around the scattered English pursuers like wolves surrounding sheep. Axes meant for formation fighting were useless in individual combat. English warriors who had been invincible behind their shields were cut down like wheat before the scythe. The pattern was set. Norman cavalry would charge the shield wall, be repulsed, then feign retreat. English warriors, seeing victory within reach, would break ranks to pursue. Norman reserves would appear from nowhere to slaughter the scattered defenders. Each cycle cost Harold dozens of his best men. Each loss weakened the shield wall further. But the Anglo-Saxons adapted. Harold's veterans learned to ignore the false retreats. The shield wall held its discipline even as Norman cavalry thundered past in apparent panic. William's tactic was working, but slowly, too slowly. The October sun was climbing toward noon, and the Norman duke could feel precious time slipping away like blood from a wound. That's when William unleashed his masterstroke. Combining his cavalry charges with concentrated archery, he created a tactical innovation that would dominate medieval warfare for generations. As Norman knights thundered up the slope, Norman archers elevated their aim, shooting high arcs that would drop their arrows behind the English shields into the packed ranks of the second and third lines. The effect was devastating. Arrows that couldn't penetrate the great shields of the front rank found the gaps between them, striking men who thought themselves safe behind their comrades' protection. The shield wall began to thin from within, as wounded men fell back, and dead men created spaces that couldn't be filled. Harold's carefully maintained formation started to develop cracks, tiny at first, but growing wider with each assault. The king himself fought like a man possessed. Contemporary accounts describe him wielding his great two-handed axe with superhuman skill, cutting down Norman knights even as they pressed closer to his position. His royal standard, the fighting man of Wessex, flew defiantly above the chaos, a rallying point for defenders who could see their line beginning to crumble around them. But courage, even royal courage, couldn't overcome mathematics. William had brought 7,000 fresh men to face Harold's exhausted army. The Normans could afford losses. They could rotate tired troops, bring up reserves, maintain the pressure hour after hour. The Anglo-Saxons had what they started with, nothing more. Every casualty weakened them. Every hour favored their enemies. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the battlefield, the shield wall was dying by inches. What had begun as an unbroken line of iron now resembled a battered fence, full of gaps and weak points. Norman knights no longer charged the wall directly. Instead, they probed for openings, seeking the moments when exhausted defenders let their shields drop or when wounded men left positions unfilled. The end, when it came, arrived with shocking suddenness. Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king, fell sometime in the late afternoon, whether by arrow, lance, or sword. Whether fighting to the last or already mortally wounded, the sources disagree. What matters is that the royal standard fell, and with it, the heart went out of English resistance. The housecarls fought on around their dead king's body. These warriors, bound by oath stronger than death, formed a final circle of shields and axes. They knew the battle was lost. They knew rescue was impossible. They fought anyway, because dying well was more important than living badly. One by one, they fell, until Norman cavalry trampled over the last defenders of Anglo-Saxon England. As dusk settled over Senlac Ridge, the silence was broken only by the groans of the wounded and the cries of ravens. The battlefield was carpeted with bodies. Norman, Breton, English, French, they lay together in the democracy of death. But when the counting was done, one fact stood clear. Harold's army was destroyed. William's victory was complete. The Duke of Normandy stood among the corpses of his enemies and saw not just a battlefield, but the grave of an entire civilization. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had ruled England for 6 centuries was finished. In its place would rise something new, something foreign, something that would reshape every aspect of English life, from language to law, from architecture to aristocracy. The conquest of England had only just begun. William stood victorious on that blood-soaked ridge, but controlling a battlefield is different from controlling a kingdom. The Norman Duke now faced a challenge that would test him more than any cavalry charge or shield wall. He had to transform military victory into lasting rule, and the Anglo-Saxon people were not about to submit quietly to foreign masters. The immediate aftermath revealed the true scope of what had been lost. Harold's brothers lay dead beside their king. Gurth and Leofwine, the last of the Godwinson dynasty, had fallen defending the royal standard. The earls who might have rallied resistance were scattered or slain. The housecarls who formed the backbone of Anglo-Saxon military might were corpses cooling in the October twilight. In a single day, England had been decapitated. Yet William's problems were far from over. London still held out, its walls manned by whatever forces remained. The northern earls had survived Fulford and might yet raise new armies. Edgar Etheling, the last prince of the old royal house, lived to press his claim. Most dangerous of all, the common people of England had not fought at Hastings. Their loyalty remained to be tested. William's march on London became a masterclass in psychological warfare. Rather than assault the city directly, he carved a path of destruction through the surrounding countryside. Village after village felt the bite of Norman steel. Crops were burned, livestock slaughtered, homes put to the torch. The message was clear: submit or face the consequences. But the Normans weren't just destroying, they were transforming. Everywhere William's army passed, the landscape began to change. Wooden palisades gave way to stone towers. Anglo-Saxon halls were torn down to make room for Norman keeps. The very architecture of power was being rewritten in stone and mortar. Each new castle a declaration that the old world was dead and buried. The psychological impact was devastating. For centuries, Anglo-Saxon England had known invasion and conquest, but always the invaders had eventually been absorbed, becoming English themselves. The Danes had settled and converted. The Vikings had been beaten back or integrated. But these Normans were different. They didn't come to join English society. They came to replace it entirely. Christmas Day, 1066. Westminster Abbey witnessed a coronation unlike any in English history. William of Normandy, now William the Conqueror, placed the crown of England on his head while Norman knights stood guard at the doors. The ceremony was conducted in Latin, not English. The nobles who attended were foreign faces speaking foreign tongues. Even the very ritual declared that England now belonged to strangers. But crowns don't guarantee obedience, and William quickly discovered that conquest was only the beginning. Resistance flickered to life across the kingdom like sparks from a dying fire. In the west, Harold's sons launched raids from Ireland. In the north, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria plotted rebellion. Danish fleets appeared off the coast, hoping to profit from English chaos. Each uprising was crushed with methodical brutality. William had learned the lessons of empire from studying Roman histories. Mercy was weakness. Compromise was defeat. Only overwhelming force could break a people's will to resist. His response to rebellion became known as the Harrying of the North, a campaign of destruction so complete that chroniclers compared it to a biblical plague. Imagine entire counties laid waste, villages burned so thoroughly that their locations were forgotten, farms destroyed, livestock killed, wells poisoned, mills torn down stone by stone. The people fled south or died where they stood. Fields that had fed thousands for generations returned to wilderness. Archaeological evidence suggests that parts of northern England didn't recover their pre-conquest population levels for over a century. The numbers tell the story of systematic extermination. Modern historians estimate that over 100,000 people died in the harrying, most from starvation and disease rather than sword strokes. Entire communities simply vanished from the historical record. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, usually precise in its documentation, falls into stunned silence when describing the devastation. Meanwhile, the transformation of English society accelerated with terrifying efficiency. Norman nobles seized Anglo-Saxon estates wholesale. Ancient bloodlines that traced their ancestry back to the first Germanic settlers found themselves dispossessed and exiled. By 1086, 20 years after Hastings, the Domesday Book recorded a revolution in land ownership so complete that only 2 major Anglo-Saxon landholders remained in the entire kingdom. The cultural genocide was equally thorough. Old English, the language that had produced Beowulf and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, disappeared from official use almost overnight. Latin became the language of government and church. Norman French the tongue of the court and aristocracy. English survived only in the mouths of peasants and the halls of the dispossessed. Even the stones themselves were conscripted into service. Norman masons arrived with new techniques and foreign styles. The great wooden halls where Anglo-Saxon kings had held court were demolished to make way for stone keeps that rose like giant fists above conquered towns. Canterbury Cathedral was torn down and rebuilt. Westminster Abbey was expanded beyond recognition. Every major church and castle proclaimed Norman dominance in granite and limestone, and so the transformation was complete. In the span of a single generation, England had become unrecognizable. The language spoken in royal halls was foreign. The laws that governed the land were imported. The very names carved on church stones belonged to strangers. A civilization that had endured for 6 centuries, that had survived Roman withdrawal and Viking fury, had been erased by one day's bloodshed on a Sussex hilltop. This wasn't conquest. This was replacement. The England that rose from the ashes of Senlac Ridge was Norman to its core, and the Anglo-Saxon world became nothing more than a memory whispered in the shadows of history.